Well, we are at the hour of the day, and I just got a note from the tech team to say we're ready to start to record. So welcome to all of you on the screen. We are recording this morning's event, and so that we can share it with folks who aren't able to be here at 5:30 BC time, 8:30 Ontario time. But we want to welcome you all. And we have some folks here at Edith Rankin. The choir is gathering downstairs and watching on the big screen. So Gary, you can't see them, but they can see you.
Okay, thanks for the warning.
And so we also have some folks from the Tri-Region Affirming Group and from the East Central Ontario Affirming Forum. So welcome to you. We're grateful to have you here with us this morning as well. And we intend to be able to use this as a shared resource in those communities and others so that folks can have the blessing of this time of gathering information, story sharing. I'm sure there'll be a bit of poetry if we're lucky, and wisdom from our guest this morning, Gary Paterson. Gary Paterson is a former moderator of the United Church of Canada. Gary Paterson is a wise elder. Gary Paterson is a poet and storyteller. Gary Paterson is a gifted theologian. Gary Paterson is just a pretty cool dude.
Yeah.
Hey.
When I was in ministry, when Gary was the moderator, it was the first experience of having an actual relationship with the moderator of the United Church that was blessing on top of blessing on top of blessing. And I feel so fortunate that that's something we've been able to carry on all these years later. Gary blessed the church with his leadership, but also with his liturgy. And it was such a gift to be able to receive that. And Gary was also at the time the first moderator of the United Church who was living in an out same gender relationship, marriage. And so this allowed the church to be able to live into its commitments of 1988 to say that we will be an institution that affirms all gender and all sexuality in leadership in the church. And so as we continue our conversation about becoming an affirming ministry, who better to help provide leadership than our very own Gary Paterson, who's coming to us live this morning from Vancouver, where it is 5:30 a.m. and dark. So Gary, we welcome you. We are so blessed to have you and grateful for your friendship and your continued leadership in the church. And we're going to turn it over to you to guide us and lead us in this time.
Okay. Well, now that I've almost finished my first cup of coffee, I am really glad to be here. You would not have wanted to see me about 45 minutes ago when I'm grumping my way out of bed and into the shower thinking, why did I agree to this? I must have had a sort of a brain blip about time change and all that it necessitated. And yet I was delighted to hear the news that Edith Rankin Memorial United Church was moving forward as on the journey to becoming an affirming congregation. And I wanted partly just to say blessings and congratulations. I just think that is exciting news. And I have a fondness, I must confess, for Kingston. I did my Master's of Literature, English Literature, many years ago at Queen's, and really enjoyed my time there and thought Kingston was one of the more beautiful cities that we have in Canada. So it's just really saying I'm so glad that to be here, and once again to see Michelle and Joyce, and our connection goes back to the time when her previous pastorate, and so I'm really delighted to be here with you folks as well, and to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, the whole process of becoming affirming. And I want to not only commend you, but to remind you of what may seem like a small step, but that is actually a major move and a real change. I sort of carry in my heart those words from the anthropologist, sociologist Margaret Mead, who she once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that has ever done so." And I believe that your journey into becoming affirming will, in some small ways within Kingston, perhaps in a larger field, actually begin to change the world. Now, it won't always be easy. There are going to be bumps along the way. And once again, I'm consoled by information that I came across when I was much younger, much more restless. And someone wiser than me came and said, look, here's a little bit of information about the change process. For an individual to make a change in something that is substantive and dearly held as a value, it takes 10 years for that change to manifest itself. For an institution like the church, it takes up to 20 years. And for a society make a change, it takes up to 50 years. And I thought, 50 years? And yet, here I am at the age in my 7th decade, finally seeing some of those social changes being taken for granted. And one of the joys of my life is to watch a new generation of young people not have to go through some of the struggles that I know that I had to some time ago. So I wanted to take you back just briefly, some 50 or 60 years, to when I was a burgeoning teenager, full of adolescent hormones and puberty just all around, and recognizing that I was starting to grapple with this, what was terrifying reality, which I tried to keep pushing out of my mind, that I was physically attracted to men. And I prayed to God over and over. I was a church boy. I went and taught Sunday school. I was in the youth group saying, please, God, fix me, fix me. And nothing happened. And I remained with the same attractions and impulses and didn't know what to do with it. I had nobody but nobody to talk to. And so one of the factors of that time in my life was feeling so much alone. And I share that because there are probably young people in Kingston who, despite all the changes that have happened, still feel some of that. And while the word gay is the popular one, or lesbian, or even the short, quick initials, I am LGBTQ2SIAE++, nevertheless, you often still feel so very isolated. And rather than being proud and out, you actually hear the language of your peers, where I knew that I was a fag, a homo, a queer, a pansy, a fairy. The list could go on. They weren't nice words, but they were often used within my colleagues or my friends or the circles. And you just withdraw, and what you learn is to hide. And well, the terminology metaphorically is to stay in the closet, but to not tell parents, not to tell anybody at all about this reality that you dreaded, and you just weren't sure what to do. And so I share that. I looked around in the mid-60s, and I realized that in the eyes of the government and the law, I was a criminal. In the eyes of the medical profession, if I ever dared tell my doctor, I was a sicko, psychologically disturbed and needed therapy and changing. And if I looked to the church, well, in the mid-60s, as some of you will recall, the church was not good about talking about sexuality. It happened because there were babies, but that's all we really wanted to talk about. But if it ever did mention homosexuality, it was clearly a sin, and I was going straight to hell. And there was no two ways about it. And I thought, OMG, what am I? What am I going to do with this? And I share this not so that you'll feel sorry for my teen years, because there were good times and laughing times, and you just put this over to the side, but to recognize that, in fact, it's still there. One little statistic that always disturbs me is that LGBTQ teenagers are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than their straight counterparts. And transgendered people, the rate is even higher. So it's not as if it's gone away, even though the public attitude of acceptance is much stronger. I cannot imagine what life would have been like for me if my church had said, we are going to launch into an affirming process. And I thought, maybe I'm not quite so sick. I don't know. I am remembering a long ago story. My spouse, Tim Stevenson, and just as an aside, because I'm really excited about it, this June we are celebrating 40 years of committed relationship. 40 years ago, we couldn't get married, but we did a little formal commitment with each other with some vows, and we traded keys because we had 2 apartments, and I gave him the first work of art that we were actually going to put on a wall that was ours. And that was a turning point. And only eventually did the church catch up and say we can have a covenanting service, and finally the government caught up. But this was pre-1988, in the lead up to the issue, as it was called then, being discussed at General Council. And we were giving a short workshop of explanation and background at the summer camp of Naramata, the equivalent of Five Oaks in Ontario. And we were going on and on about our growing up as gay people and our call into ministry in the church. And one woman raised her hand and says, yes, but what about the children? And there was this dead silence. And I thought, okay, there needed to be a long and careful explanation about the complete and absolute difference between pedophilia and homosexuality, which is an often confusing area for people. But then Tim, almost in tears, said, but don't you know, we're doing this because of the children, for the children. And then he looked around the room and he said, you just need to recognize that up to maybe 5 to 10% of the kids in your Sunday school and your youth groups are LGBT. And they need models, they need openness. It's precisely because of the kids that we're doing this. And you could hear a pin drop as everybody thought, oh, I mean, those people are actually our people. I can recall actually going to a church on the west side of Vancouver, and people were feeling like they were taking a chance at calling an openly gay minister. This was in 1993. Some people left when I came and went down the street to the Presbyterian church, which was a bit more conservative. We called them Presbyterian refugees, and the Presbyterian minister phoned me up a couple months later and said, you know, the people that have come from your church to mine are the most conservative. I'm not grateful. You should have kept them there and brought in change. But at that point, within the first few months, the treasurer came up quietly to me and said, my daughter is lesbian. The chair of the outreach committee came to me and said, my son is gay. A number of people came and said, my brother, my sister. I mean, you realize the number of lives that were being lived that were so hidden and so full of pain, and that my presence there as an out gay person allowed permission. And suddenly it became more normalized. And people were finally able to say, well, of course, we are everywhere, and we are part of the families. It's not us versus them. It's us in all our rainbow variety. Now, you know, as I do, that times have really changed, and I am so grateful for that. In 1969, the year that I left my teen years, and you can therefore figure out that I am now 72 and moving on vigorously, the law changed. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau said the nation has no place in the bedrooms of the nation, and homosexuality was then decriminalized. But what you may not remember or even have known is through the 50s right through until the early 90s, our government tracked and spied upon LGBT members of the military, the RCMP, and the civil service. And while they did not arrest them, they discharged them from their jobs and prevented promotion. And we're talking thousands upon thousands of people that were, and the word was purged for safety reasons. And ultimately, the reason for the discharge was given as not suitable for, advantageously for employment due to homosexuality. It did not change until they, one, arrested Michelle Douglas, subjected her to 2 days of nonstop interrogation with no legal representation in an isolated room, trying to tell her, give us the names of friends, other contacts, other people who are lesbian or gay. Oh, and by the way, we're going to be telling your parents tomorrow and announcing it to the news. So you better get ready and tell anybody that you need to tell. Michelle happened to be the top graduate from the military school and had done amazing and excellent work. And she decided to take the government to court. This was in 1990 that she was purged. She won her case rather, in 1992, and there was a quiet settlement, and she became an activist from then on. And around that time, somewhere in the early 90s, our government stopped this hunting and this purging. We have a group at my home church, St. Andrew's Wesley, called The Word Is Out, and I shared some of this news with them. And you know that there was one, this is a group of 20, and of that 20, one woman said, oh, I remember those days. I was in the military, and oh my word, did I have to hide and hide and hide. And another person said, wow, I was up and coming in the RCMP, and somebody saw me in a gay club on a Friday night in Toronto, and on Monday I was fired. In such a small circle, there were actually 2 people intimately affected by that purge. So one wonderful thing that has happened in my lifetime is that our government has apologized. And I had the honor, the privilege, and the wonder of being part of the advisory committee to the government on what should go into that apology to LGBTQ people. And just as an aside, it meant that I got 3 one-on-one hugs with himself, Justin Trudeau. And I may disagree with many of his policies, but it's nice to be hugged by the Prime Minister of your country. And he is a good hugger, let me tell you that. But I actually managed, I got a copy of the official apology with all the signatures. And let me just read you a couple of lines, okay? Because it marks the shift within our country. The number one job of any government is to keep its citizens safe. And on this, we have failed LGBTQ2S people time and time again. It is with shame and sorrow and deep regret for all the things we have done that I stand here today and say, we were wrong. We apologize. I am sorry. We are sorry. For state-sponsored systemic oppression and rejection, we are sorry. For suppressing two-spirit indigenous values and beliefs, we are sorry. For abusing the power of the law and making criminals of citizens, we are sorry. And it goes on. And it sits on my wall in my study. As a reminder of that moment of change, I was one of the people invited to sit in the gallery of the Commons when this apology was read. And I cried the whole time. I cried the whole time. And one of the wonderful things is that Justin Trudeau, again, we all have our disagreements, but he invited his 2 children to be there also in the gallery. He said, because this is a momentous historical moment, and I want my kids to see that it is 1, okay to apologize, and 2, LGBTQ2S people are part of our country and need to be included. So that was a wonderful change. I looked in the field of medicine. 1973 took a while, but eventually homosexuality was no longer considered a psychiatric illness, and things were changed in the American Psychiatric Association and the big diagnostic handbook. So you think, whew, you could go for therapy and not be told that you're, somehow sick, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Though you'll note, many, many people suffered still from what is called conversion therapy, often led by religion, where they believed that you could actually have your orientation changed if you just prayed hard enough to Jesus and had the right amount of shock therapy and aversion therapy. And I know several people who endured that to their great distress and some to their damage. And I know of one person who killed himself in the middle of it. And you'll note that it was not banned in this country till January of 2022, i.e. it's been on the books as illegal, but only for 2 months. And up until then, it was okay to take malleable teens and subject them to this kind of therapy. So you still see how the medical profession works the way. And finally, I want to tell you about the change of the church. We all know 1988, but I was one of the commissioners that was there. And I want to tell you, I could tell you about 25 stories, and we'd be here all day, and you'd need to take breaks with more coffee, more washrooms. But this is one story that I really do want to share, because in its wisdom, the church decided to deal with the report on homosexuality, lifestyle, and ministry ordination, to deal with it with a sessional committee. That is a committee with 2 people from every conference, i.e. 26 people, representing the entire theological spectrum of the church. They met for a week before General Council in Victoria in 1988 to figure out what to do with this report and how to bring forth recommendations. We heard about the formation of this committee and realized there was not one person who was an out gay person or an out lesbian person. Tim took it upon himself. He's the pushier of the 2 of us. And I sort of go, you go first, you know, a little bit like Piglet. You go first, Christopher Robin. He phoned up the General Secretary, Howie Mills, and said, this is unacceptable. Can you imagine a committee of the United Church men deciding on the role and the place and the acceptability of women in the United Church and not have a single woman on the committee? Can you imagine a committee of white people making decisions about the role and the place and the worthiness of people of color? And now you have a committee wrestling with the place and the worthiness and value of LGBT folk, and there's no representation? And Howie Mills, I think because of movement of the Spirit, heard that and said, okay, I'm going to place an openly gay and an open lesbian person on the committee, ex officio, no vote, but they will be there to share story and information. One of those people was Tim. The other was Allison Rennie, who was an out lesbian working at Naramata Center. And the 2 of them joined the committee. And the proceedings were confidential. So even between the 2 of us, Tim only told a bit. But one of the things that deeply impressed me was that the committee members filed in, 26 of them. 2 were in favor of the report, 5 were dead set against it. And the other 19 said, well, we're open to listening. They came in with the report. They came in with a file, a binder, with 1,800 resolutions and proposals from the wider church, the vast majority of which said, kill that report, no welcome to LGBTQ folk. They are sinners. And then on top of that, they put the Bible. And Tim thought, OMG, what have I gotten myself into? At which point the chairperson of that committee, Marion Best, who later became our moderator, she said, we are going to work by consensus. Nothing will be stated by this committee unless every single person is part of it. And Tim said, there it goes. There's no hope that it will ever pass. If only one person out of the 26 opposes acceptance, there will be no acceptance. But you know what happened? They were moved by the Spirit. And by the end of their week together, all 26 could agree to a common statement that said, in and of itself, sexual orientation is no barrier for a person to be or become a full member of the United Church. And then a couple of sentences later, they said, every member of the United Church is eligible to be considered for ordination. And to prove that it was consensus and not just the word of the chairperson, every member of that committee walked up on stage and said, we all stand behind this statement. And you could have heard a pin drop in the General Assembly of the General Council. Like somehow that had to be the equivalent upper room with a Pentecostal spirit moving and touching people's hearts. I know one person, one minister on that committee, unnamed, he went home to his home parish because he had been instructed to go and make sure the report did not pass. And so he was pilloried for his decision to support it. And in fact, his spouse said, if you do not renounce your decision, and say that you were caught up in some emotional manipulation, there will be trouble in our marriage. In fact, it will end our marriage. And the next Sunday, he got up and began to preach against his previous decision. And he broke down halfway through the sermon. And he said, I can't do this. The Spirit was there. It was the right decision. At which point, his wife, sitting in the front pew, stood up and walked out of the church and later began divorce proceedings. It was that heated, that powerful, and people, I think, were scared of the impact of the Spirit. You do need to know that many people said, oh, that was the beginning of the decline of the United Church. But only about 25,000 people left, which at the time was only 2.5% of the United Church membership. And you'll notice that every other mainline denomination, Anglicans, what have you, when they have exactly the same kind of decline in numbers, it had nothing to do with the LGBT decisions. In fact, that may have brought more life to us. But it was this amazing spiritual transformational movement. I could tell you many stories of individuals who later came up to me and said, it was at this moment that I realized we needed to be affirming and celebrating, not condemning and rejecting and driving out or pushing back into the closet and put a great big lock on the door so that nobody would come out. You know, when you look around the world, God absolutely loves diversity. How could anybody doubt that? I mean, I love my butterflies, and I can actually tell you when a monarch butterfly comes my way. But did you know that there are 18,000 species of butterflies in the world? 18,000. Like, who needs 18,000? Well, clearly God does, and says, oh, look at all of this that I have created. It is very, very good. And so if there is that kind of variety around the world, surely there can be variety in the people we love. Variety is the spice of life. My oldest grandchild, who is turning 17 this July, announced last summer that they were non-binary. And I said, non-binary? What's non-binary? She said, well, they said, first and foremost, the pronouns have now changed. I am they and them. And let me tell you the number of times that I flubbed on that, and a little she and a her popped out. And this young teen said, excuse me, wrong pronoun, as only a 16-year-old can say. And so you realize my challenge now was to figure out how to embrace, how to affirm, because even when you think you've gone through everything, God has surprises up God's sleeve to say, oh, you think you are affirming and inclusive. Okay, here's a grandchild, not a granddaughter anymore, a grandchild who is non-binary. So they were out to visit this last week during spring break, and a lot of conversations saying, tell me about non-binary. What does this mean for you? And another learning opportunity. But what astounds me, if God loves diversity so much, why is it that we humans just don't seem to be able to get on board with it? That we are uncomfortable with diversity. We like homogeneity. They say that in the States, the greatest hour of segregation is the hour of worship, where white and black separate, because we don't easily embrace diversity. And I've done a lot of thinking about why is that? I mean, one of the reasons is just sheer ignorance. And bless our United Church, it's put in enormous resources in education and trying to help people understand. But it goes deeper than that. It goes partly to some discomfort, awkwardness, and even some real fear. And part of the answer to that is to say, hey, I'm one of those people that you're uncomfortable with and fearful of. And I'm just an ordinary Joe like you. That was one of the callings of my being moderator, not even to have to give speeches about being gay or not gay, but just to simply show up. And people said, oh, he's like us. And it took away some of the scare. Side story, when I was called to be minister at Ryerson, we had volunteer receptionists who would receive calls, put them through. And Dory was an older woman who was a little suspicious of me, put through a call from Tim to me, but listened in instead of just hanging up. And at the end, she ran to the secretary, and I heard this from the secretary, who was a friend, Gail. She said, to Gail, oh, they're just like us. They were talking about who's doing the shopping, who's picking up the kids from school, and who's doing dinner, and don't forget to take the garbage out. And the word spread like wildfire that our telephone conversations were not somehow salacious, or that somehow we were going to be doing a gay agenda before noon and, you know, before we had lunch. But rather we were like everybody, worried about the kids, the shopping, the house, the pets, the garden. That is part of what eliminates that ignorance and fear. But it goes even deeper than that, because somehow when you meet someone who is completely different from you in a key aspect of life, like sexuality, you are forced to realize the diversity in the world, that it's okay for people to do things differently. And that can also then push against your self-esteem. In our culture, often you feel better about yourself by putting somebody else down. I have a poignant memory when I was the minister at First United, which is the downtown east side, the Skid Row of Vancouver. And I was out in the early evening, out on the streets, just being present. And a guy who had clearly had a bit too much to drink, he and I were talking. It was a bit of slurry speech. And this guy said, well, I may be a drunk, but at least I'm not a goddamn fag. And I thought, oh, is this the moment that I come out to him? Is this the moment just to talk generally and gently about, well, actually, you know, diversity? And then you think, no, maybe when he's sober, I'll check him out tomorrow. But to realize that people get their value sometimes by putting down others. In fact, maybe at the deepest level, the trouble with that we have with diversity is that we use people who are different, who are other, in order to project on them some of our own personal negativity. And so we demonize them, we call them the other. I have a friend who's Jewish. His mother always said to him, watch whatever is happening to the gay people around you, because whatever is happening to them is going to happen to us next. So that when you get rid of one scapegoat, you turn to another. And LGBT people are often the scapegoats. If you've been following some of the pontificating that goes on about the war in Ukraine, oh, God forbid that we humans should be doing something like that. But I don't like to point at individuals and denominations, but the Moscow Patriarch of the Orthodox Church of Russia, Monsieur Kirill, actually said the reason that Russia is invading Ukraine is that they are starting to pick up the sick ways of the Western world and its decadence and are having gay pride parades, and we must stop that. And I'm thinking, why are you so down on one small segment? Sometimes I think it's because of greed and power, not necessarily to LGBT, but often racism is a cover for justifying slavery. Sometimes anti-Semitism is a justification to grab money from Jewish people and expel them. And sometimes it gets so bad that there is ethnic cleansing and genocide. And the word faggot, as you know, comes from faggots, which were the fuel that was often used to burn gay people at the stake in medieval times. And so you look at that and say, we have a lot of work to do. No wonder affirming work is difficult, eh? Because you're hitting some of our deepest worries and all our mechanisms of scapegoating and projecting stuff we don't like in ourselves onto others. Now, we have to figure out as humans and as church how to live with differences and recognize that unity does not necessarily equal uniformity. It's unity with diversity, and that's precisely what God is challenging us to engage in. And now, oh, good, I still have some more time before questions, because I want to actually shift from any theories, because the shortest distance between any two people is a story. And I want to tell you 2 or 3 stories from my own experience. One is a friend now, Jim, I won't last name. At the end of 1988, Jim, who's a minister on Vancouver Island, motion be over. And he said, Gary, I want you to know that I'm praying for you. And I said, oh, Jim, if you are praying to God that I shall be magically changed into a happy heterosexual, I want you to take your prayers off my body. And Jim said, no, Gary, not praying for that at all. I am simply holding you up in love to God. God knows what might be needed. I don't. I'm just holding you up in love. And I ask you, will you please pray for me in the same way? And so you had this sort of lefty, gay, progressive, so-called, and this very straight, more conservative, not progressive, according to me, other minister. And we made a bond to pray for each other. And I think that's part of what it means to be affirming, that we figure out how to pray for the people with whom we may not always agree. But loving has something very different at times from necessarily liking. There could be somebody who irritates you for any number of good reasons, and they happen to sit halfway down the pew. And you think, okay, I've got to figure out how to love them, though I may not always like them. But there's an addendum to this story. 2 years later, at the annual meeting of the then conference, Jim beckoned me and said, Gary, need a coffee. And so off we went, coffee, coffee. Jim said, and started to tear up. He said, I need to tell you how grateful I am to you and to Tim and to the LGBT community and to my church, because my son came out to me this year. And without the church, I would have tossed him out of our family. But because of knowing you and our church and my learnings, I was able to embrace him and accept him. And I am grateful. And I thought, now there is the power of prayer, holding up someone into the love and the heart of God. One final addendum, 2 years later, same thing, annual meeting of conference. Jim said, Gary, come have coffee. Okay, another coffee. Here we go. And I'm so proud and so excited. A couple of months ago, I presided at the marriage of my son and his partner, husband and husband. And it was a moment of joy. And I thought that wouldn't have happened without an affirming church right across the board. Okay, another story. Okay, this one of the things you're going to find as you become an affirming congregation, that while we are rejoicing in the United Church, large branches of Christianity are still homophobic or anti-gay. And I sometimes get discouraged because the Catholics still call me disordered. The Orthodox in all its varieties don't even want to ever mention the subject. Evangelicals are fundraising in the States and now have doubled their fundraising in order to say you can't even say the word gay in schools anymore. The Pentecostals, which is the fastest growing movement of the church in the world, is not quite virulently, but absolutely anti-gay. And I'm thinking, what is this? But I have discovered that there are a number of people who have been hurt and almost broken by some branches of Christianity. And then they hear about the United Church and they don't even believe it, but they come sometimes in a hidden way to check us out. David was one of those. He grew up in a very evangelical family. He was very religious, loved God deeply, but slowly in his teen years had to wrestle with being a gay guy and was told those two don't go together. You're either a Christian or you're gay. It's an either or, zero sum. And he left the church. He tried to stay for many years and it was driving him crazy. And finally he left and found his way as a gay man. But there was this heartache. And then a friend said, well, there's this church up the street, St. Andrew's Wesley. They're affirming. And he said, affirming? What the heck is that? And they said, well, they actually accept gay people. No. Yes, they do. So a Sunday sometime later, David made his way into the church on a Sunday morning, sat in the back pew so that he could make his escape as quickly as possible, if necessary. And he shared with the congregation later that on that morning, he heard a voice. He said, maybe in my head, my heart, I don't know where it came from, but the voice said, oh, David, welcome home. I've missed you. And he spent the service in tears and crying and has become, for the last several years, a deeply involved member of the congregation with many gifts. And I want to tell you, there will be former Catholics, former evangelical, former spiritual but not religious, because who will see your explicit or public or intentional statements of we are affirming, and they will find haven, they will find a way back to God. Okay, another story. This one's a little more fun. I was called to St. Andrews Wesley, and people there should have been, it was because it was later, it was not 2005, but there were still some people who were really anxious and apprehensive. What are we going to do with an openly gay minister, and he's actually married, and what do we do with that? Oh, well, he preaches a half decent sermon, so maybe we can put up with him. And I decided that we perhaps should be in the Gay Pride Parade. And I had imagined a car, a car, 8 people and a small banner saying, here we are, here we are. But I asked Don, a member of the congregation, that he would take responsibility for organizing some entry into the parade. He came back to me a week later and he said, Gary, I've approached 2 or 3 people in the congregation. I have some funding for this. I have rented a 46-foot flatbed truck. I have a committee that is now building a replica of the church out of paper mache and cardboard. We've actually included stained glass windows. I've got permission from the executive director to borrow a few pews. We'll bolt them down. And I have now, for our gospel choir, arranged for a professional recording on the North Shore, and we'll have a soundtrack of our best gospel music, but the gospel choir will be on the float and they will sing and lip sync to the whole time, and we will just march through the parade. And he accomplished it. And there were 82 people walking with the float, ages ranging from 2 to 92. The 92 was sitting on one of the pews on the truck. And Kurt came up to me. He was the leader of the gospel choir and a handsome gay man. And he said, it's a hot, hot day. Gary, is it okay if I take off my t-shirt? And I thought, go for it. Well, he became an instant star in the parade. I also put in a small prayer to God saying, please do not have our float beside one of the nightclub floats where you have men in hopefully something dancing away. And I thought, please, God, no. God heard me and said, no nightclub floats. But behind you is going to be marching the organization called Women Against Violence Against Women, WAVA, wonderfully progressive group. But they believed in going topless with little pasties. And they loved our gospel music and began marching in rhythm so that everything was in rhythm. And so there wasn't anybody who didn't look at our float, whether you were straight or gay or whatever. It was like we won first prize in the entire gay parade. And the next Sunday, 3 or 4 people came into the church and said, we want to join. And they weren't gay or lesbian. They were families with kids. This is lovely music, but you'd think it was me, but it's not me.
Sorry, the tech team, the Irmak laptop, if you can mute it, that would be helpful. Thank you. Sorry, okay. Gary.
No. At any rate, they said, we want to be part of a church like that, that is open and accepting, and that's the kind of environment that we want to have with our kids. And I think I'm going to stop, but I have, I have 2 more things. One is just to let you know, when I was moderator, a task of the moderator is to visit some of our overseas partners. It was a turn for the moderator to go to Africa, but our African partners said, please don't come. And I said, well, why? They said, well, you're gay. And I said, well, that's only one small part of who I am. I don't have to ever talk about it. There are many things I can talk about. They said, that's true, and we'd love to hear them, but anybody who talks to you while you are here, precisely because you are so open and the press will report on it, will be in danger, serious danger, once you leave. And so you're going to have to trust us to do the work. Our South American partners, Latin American partners said, please come. And if possible, bring your spouse. I said, bring my spouse? They said, yes. And I thought, Latin America, machismo, not known for embracing LGBT, but the churches there, at least a couple of countries, said, we want to hear your story. And normally the moderator listens to the stories from our partners so that she or he can bring those stories back to the larger community here in Canada. But they said, no, will you do a workshop about the inclusive community? And so in Colombia, we did about 5 different workshops. And just recently, the Methodist Church of Colombia ordained their first open lesbian, Paula. And we were also invited to do workshops in Cuba, which is not known for being a welcoming place for LGBT people because of the sort of the closed walls of the revolution. And there was a change, and we were able to tell our story precisely because we were open and affirming and public and present for people. And as I said, when I traveled across Canada as the moderator, somebody came up to me and they said, when I think of gay people, I think of you and Tim. And I think of you as Mr. and Mr. Gay United Church. And you guys look really ordinary. And you raised 3 kids, and you know what our lives are like. And thank you. Because you see, I was lucky to be able to have joint custody of my 3 daughters. My former wife and I are, well, after my friendship with Tim, she is my second best friend. And we've kept in close contact because of our girls. And every single beginning of the school year, we would go and visit our children's teachers and say, these daughters, these young women come from a different kind of family. And we need you to know that. And one teacher, Emily was in grade 5, Mr. Zerby, he said, I totally support you, but this is my 2nd year of teaching. And I don't know quite how to handle this. And we said, okay, what if we build a 1-week curriculum for socials about different families, gay families, lesbian families, single parent families, blended families, extended families. We know they're all in the school and in your classroom because of what our children have shared with us. And he said, that would be marvelous. And so maybe part of your task will be working for SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, into the curriculum in the schools in Ontario. It's there, but there's been enormous resistance, and perhaps part of it is to be present. Maybe it is to set up a gay and straight alliance within the safety of the church. There's a church in Montreal that talked to the neighbors in the community and realized that there was a need for an LGBT prom because LGBT folk could not bring their partners, their dates, to the school dance to signify the end. There's so many different ways. But I'm going to stop with one poem. Michelle said there's got to be a poem somewhere. And this is actually a song, a lullaby written by Fred Small. And I sang it fairly regularly to my girls as I tucked them into bed. And then when Tim and I had our formal marriage and all the celebration, at the reception, my 3 daughters, our 3 daughters, because Tim was stepdad, they sang this song back to us in front of everybody else. And it goes, I won't sing it to you. You'd mute everything, but I'll treat it as a poem. We have cleared off the table, the leftovers saved, washed the dishes and put them away. I have told you a story and tucked you in tight at the end of your knockabout day, as the moon sets its sails over the sea, to carry you to sleep over the midnight sea. I will sing you a song no one sang for me. May it keep you good company. You can be anybody that you want to be. You can love whomever you will. You can travel any country where your heart wills, and know I will love you still. You can live by yourself. You can gather friends around. You can choose one special one. And the only measure of your words and your deeds will be the love you leave behind when you're done. Oh, some girls grow up strong and bold. Some boys are gentle and kind. Some race on ahead, some follow behind. Some move in their own space and time. Some women love women. Some men love men. Some raise children and some never do. You can dream all the day, thinking everything, and never reach the end of everything possible for you. Don't be haunted by names or taunted by games, but seek out spirits true. If you give your friends the best part of yourself, they will do the same back for you. You can be anybody that you want to be. You can love whomever you choose. You can travel any country where your heart leads, and know I will love you still. You can live by yourself. You can gather friends around. You can choose one special one, but the only measure of your words and your deeds will be the love you leave behind when you're done. Will be the love you leave behind when you're done. Amen.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thanks for sharing your heart and your stories. We're going to open it up, folks, for the next 8 or 10 minutes for question and answer before Paul Van Ness thanks Gary on our behalf and tells us about next month. So I have moved my screen to gallery view. Give me a little shake, unmute yourself if you would like to ask Gary a question or share a comment. Yeah, Kathy Bear, go ahead.
I want to thank you so much for this. This is a real eye-opener for me. I was living, unfortunately, in the States in 1988 and finding out what was happening through the Monthly Observer that was coming to Houston, Texas. So we missed a lot of the backstory about how my parents, who had been chair of the UCW on the board, were shunned by their church when they announced that my brother was gay. They ended up in a community of concern church, and they've left the church and they've never gone back. So being welcoming to people who have stories to tell is such an important thing for me. And I was part of the affirming movement in the first United Church east of Toronto, here in Kingston, in Sydenham Street United Church. So I'm so glad Edith Rankin's on this journey as well, because I'm just, you can tell how emotional it is for me. So thank you so much.
Amen. Just as a side note, the church in the early 90s was wrestling with what are the implications of the 88 decision and how do we assist congregations. And so Affirm United, S'affirmer Ensemble, came up with the Affirming Congregation program in 1995. First church to be an affirming church was St. Augustine in Winnipeg. By the end of 95, there were 5 churches. The year 2000, the National United Church gave the stamp of approval on the whole process. And now there are hundreds of churches that are affirming. Not as many as you'd like. It's a movement, a slow snowball growing movement. Mind you, many other churches, not having gone through the process, are very welcoming, but it's still something that excites my heart.
This is Katie Cox, and I'm a visitor and a former roommate of Kathy Bear's and knew her brother. But I just want to say I've had the privilege of being with 2 congregations when they have become affirming. It has been a thoughtful process. One was in Alberta, in Edmonton, St. Paul's, and one was in Penticton in BC, Oasis United, which has the blessing of having Mary and Bess nearby, who we did it through a consensus process rather than a vote. But now I'm living in Ontario and I belong to a welcoming, but not an affirming church. So we're the one that hosts the worship service during Pride Week, but it may be time that we explore the affirming process. One thing I said in Penticton when we were becoming affirming was our optician in Edmonton had the rainbow flag on the door, declaring that all were welcome there. If they could do it, why couldn't we do it as a church? And Gary, I did hear you preach when you preached the open service at Naramata.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes. Well, Katie, I would say amen to your comments. And just to let you know that St. Andrews Wesley, where I was serving, did not want to become affirming or go through the process because they said we already are. We have a gay minister, we have this, da, 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 da. And somebody said, no, it's helpful to go through this process. 1, you learn more. And 2, well, that acronym Pi Day, March 14th, a play on pi, the 3.14159, and then I get lost. But they said public, intentional, explicit. And although you know you're welcoming, often visitors, strangers, or LGBT folk who are apprehensive for good reason. The church has not always been a good ally. They need to see that public declaration. So I would commend the process strongly and highly.
We are going to move things over to Paul Bennis to be able to thank Gary on our behalf.
Can I just give one other word?
Of course.
Michelle convinced me to not only come for breakfast, but she said, well, now that you're awake, you might as well stay for worship. And so I want to tell you that the sermon will not be a repeat of what you've heard. I've got these 2 piles of paper saying this story goes here. No, don't. No, put it here. So you will hear something completely different in the sermon. So you don't need to check out and say, oh, been there, done that, heard that guy. Anyhow.
I'm very happy to jump in, Gary, and I'm laughing out loud because that was going to be my first query. Where do you go from here? Here
Back
comes
to the Bible.
service.
Yeah.
So we the people in the United Church of Canada are so fortunate that you have been the right person in the right place at the right time, going back to the 80s. And your context that you've given us on the medical side of things, the government side of things, the church side of things, the social and individual side of things, you've brought them very much alive to all of us. We do not want to be a congregation that augments the aloneness that any people feel. And I'll elaborate slightly on that anybody feels in a moment. But I want to conclude my thanks to you by going back to what Michelle said at the beginning. You're a cool guy. Thank you, Gary.